Good. All right. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us for our second iteration of this live event. We're going to be doing these every month. The goal is really to cover a topic that we find interesting in industry. We work with a lot of really interesting customers, and very seldom can we speak publicly about the work that they're doing, but we find a lot of interesting trends, and we always want to share these and hopefully get a bit of a discussion going over the course of the month. This month, what we're particularly interested in talking about is how design being presented in a deck presentation format versus being presented in an immersive format could totally transform the way that people understand the work that's being presented. Every so often, we see that this really amazing design is being presented, but in isolation. It's kind of like in a very beautiful render on its own. There's a little bit of context in the background. You might understand it's in like a desert or something like this, but it doesn't quite tell the story of the human interacting with that particular design. And so you have to have a bunch of different slides that would kind of accentuate why and how this design kind of needs to exist. And so once we started to get into this idea of importing and kind of bringing gravity sketches to more of a sandbox type of environment, we started seeing designers, especially designers in industry, really map to this and build out like worlds that the design lived within, even sometimes being relatively fictitious, as though, it's just an imaginary world, but it had the right elements, the right context, so that anyone that's participating in a design review could completely understand what the designer is trying to convey through that design. And so the theme that we're following this month is all around how you can leverage these immersive technologies for storytelling. And so we have some great guests joining today. From our side, we have David. He's working really closely with Nike in Portland. And we have Alejandro. I'll let you introduce yourself, Alejandro, on your side.
Hi, Shay. Thank you for the invitation. Always a pleasure. So my name is Alejandro. I've been partnering with GS for over 6 years. So I've been a professor at the University of Cincinnati, and we actually were one of the first EDU partners. So my specialty with GS really focuses in the classroom, but in the past 2 years, I've been leading a research lab in which it really focuses on new use cases for technology. So my partnership with GS has really grown, and I have some really interesting examples that I'd love to share on how GS has been leveraged beyond the classroom, beyond industry, and actually opening up new paths for new industries, new customers. And honestly, I mean, you said it yourself, Shay, the context is most important. So GS can be leveraged as a tool for informing anybody of context in a way that you didn't have the possibility before. So thanks for the invite.
Yeah, thanks for joining. And David, maybe just share with everyone a little bit with what you can share, what you do with Nike and GraviSketch.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been working with companies like Nike, Converse, Jordan for the past 2 years, just trying to get these industry leaders to see the value of designing products spatially for concepts to reveal themselves in a more resolved fashion to help designers fully communicate their intent in a spatial manner. And that's something that is a pretty core part of GraviSketch, and it's all about communicating that sort of design intent in 3D. So yeah.
Awesome. So I'll open it up with kind of an admission. When we first started GraviSketch, we were really focused and fixated on the design itself. And that's why, even to this day, you have this kind of devoid background. It's gray. There's a gray on the floor. It's all about the work that's right in front of you. And over time, we started to kind of be humbled a little bit with people wanting to build an environment around them that they're working within, first, just for inspiration. So we started to introduce things like imagery and so forth. And then later, like actually building out the context so that they can relate the relative size of something, or the feeling that a vehicle would look like kind of driving through a cityscape. And so we've been learning a lot about this way of presenting and way of, I guess, developing ideas, because it doesn't just come in the presentation, it comes in the iterations. And so I'd love to hear from both of you how you've seen these tools being leveraged, like importing imagery, importing additional 3D references, and kind of how, I guess, just how impactful this way of working outside of just working on the individual objects. I think we understand the value of GraviSketch, you can build an amazing individual object. But I think where we're learning and where we're still growing as a company is understanding what the value of being in that immersive environment and being able to tailor and curate that immersive environment is. So we'd love to just hear from you guys a little bit about this.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, we're really talking about storytelling, and VR, AR has the potential of really, leveraging the content in a new way. I think for me and in my experience with Gravity Sketch, really storytelling can be split into two moments. One is VR as a creation and validation tool, which means, in a design process, where Gravity Sketch started was really in the prototyping side. How can you create a design and evolve it in VR? But then, as you said, we also have found use cases even before that. How can you even map out research before you know what to design? How can you present the final outcome? So really where Gravity Sketch has become an all-encompassing platform is the way I teach it in the classroom, and the way we've innovated with some other industry partners is it's a platform to conquer all platforms. It's a place where you go back and forth. You have 2D, 3D assets that you can bring, and Gravity Sketch has become this place where you exhibit all of it. So you exhibit your design process and the sequence of how you come up with a design. For students, I can't tell you how impactful it is to see your design in one-to-one scale from the very first sketch, but then start adding more and more context imagery. And then from the second side, VR as a presentation tool. For me, and especially hosting exhibitions, hosting partners, for example, at my lab, it's incredibly impactful to not only show the process of how you came up with the concept and the design, but show it in the context itself. So it's a very, very powerful idea of creating a VR exhibition room that matches the context of your project, but it also tells the 2D and 3D story. And then now, as you know, if you add the new layer of AR, you can have what in my lab we published a paper on in collaboration with Gravity Sketch. It's called multi-level prototyping. You can have a mock-up, a physical mock-up that you're sitting on with the headset you're seeing, everything around you, but then in VR in Gravity Sketch, you're overlaying real-time information. I can tell you with people who have never tried VR, who I bring in the lab, from city government, from other entities, they're blown away by this whole side of VR that they didn't know. Oftentimes, people who are not experts in VR, they usually are familiar with VR as a visualization tool at the end, kind of like the image behind me. What they don't know is VR can be, and Gravity Sketch can be a tool that can be used in all aspects of the process. So in my lab, for example, we've had co-design sessions with city planners, and eventually we came up with a whole plan for the city, but it all started in co-design in Gravity Sketch, and they're blown away by how immersive it is. And in real time, they make a suggestion and you apply it. So for me, really, VR is a creation tool on one end, and VR is a presentation tool. In terms of story, I mean, it's really limitless. It's really about understanding your context and leveraging the 2D and 3D aspects of the tool.
Yeah. Sweet. I think working with like Nike, for example, people are so used to seeing things presented in, let's say, a 2D space, like a whiteboarding tool like Miro, right? And while those are very familiar spaces, when you're designing performance product, for example, that is going to exist in a very specific environment and setting. One of the underutilized features of Gravity Sketch is, let's say, bring in the HDRI to really set the scene, right? And to make people feel like they are in the environment that the product will eventually exist in. And you might be able to even generate that through, these AI HDRI tools to really curate exactly the aesthetic of that scene that you're looking for. For example, it's a football stadium, right? If you're designing a pair of cleats that will eventually be used in that way. And you're able to present your concepts that you made in Gravity Sketch in situ, right? Immersively at scale with the imagery to accompany it. That doesn't just exist on a 2D plane, because that's not the environment in which the product will end up living in anyways, right? So it's just a super powerful tool, not just to create spatially, but to communicate, right? Even details such as the final setting of the product and spatially. So.
Very helpful. Maybe just thinking about storytelling as designers, period. Maybe we zoom out of Gravity Sketch and VR just for a second. I often find, especially when I'm seeing automotive commercials or footwear commercials, there's a celebration around the sketch, like a very simple sketch. And then there's a celebration around the final form, right? And there's like a lot of stuff missing in between. Like now that I'm learning more about footwear, I'm like, whoa, there's like, it's not just, an awesome footwear designer landing a beautiful little sketch here, and then the shoe comes to life. I've now been to Vietnam, I've now been to Taiwan, Korea with David as well. And we've seen the factory side, and we see how they have to receive information, and we've seen how one sketch has to go through so many iterations before it becomes the real thing. And I kind of want to like just talk about how storytelling of the process is important. Now, for a consumer of footwear, I'm just seeing the sketch and the final product, and I have to make that connection on my own. But I'm now learning more and more that it's really important for people within the organization to understand the story of where you started and where you're trying to end up. So maybe we could just talk about the importance of telling the journey from here's my idea as it starts to kind of all those manifestations in between, and here's where it ended up.
Yeah. As the footwear design process, which is traditionally very 2D, right? As we're trying to change that and process becomes more 3D native, you lose, if you're just trying to tell the story of process through 2D mediums, you lose a lot of the ability and richness if you're presenting just using PowerPoint or just using like a 2D whiteboarding software, right? And so being able to show off different iterations of the 3D process in a 3D native space like Gravity Sketch really allows you to bring folks along the journey in a more authentic way that doesn't leave any that doesn't leave that big gap, right, between thumbnail napkin sketch that looks like almost like a piece of art, right, to the final product, right? And so even if you're trying to sell in a design, for example, prior to design finalization, it's really, really useful to be able to show different stakeholders, whether it's product line managers or maybe members of the development team, an authentic view of how exactly you got to that final concept in 3D, because that's where you're working to begin with, right? There's less translation, there's less information loss. It's just a more fuller and more coherent story.
Yeah, I completely agree with David. And in my case, my background is in transportation and mobility, and there are lots of similarities between automotive and footwear. Really, that high impact, attractive sketch will continue to stay. It's still an expectation. However, a 2D image brings many things up to interpretation, whereas in GS you can combine what I see as a very powerful thing in storytelling is that you can combine 2D and 3D storytelling in a whole process, in a holistic process. And as David said, it can be a very authentic, curated experience for anybody. So the way I use and I teach Gravity Sketches really as a back and forth tool. So we won't get rid of hand sketching, we won't get rid of 2D rendering. Those are still components within the design process. However, GS becomes a tool to enhance the process in each of the stages. So with my students and with my industry partners in the lab, we use GS as a back and forth tool. You go through a round of ideation traditionally, then you go immediately to GS, you bring your imagery in 2D, you map out in 3D some early concepts. They can be functional, they can be aesthetic. Then a really interesting thing is you can start using them as underlays as well. So if you take some really nice screenshots of your early GS, then they become your underlay for your next evolution of sketches, and so on. You go back and forth up until you have a pretty developed concept in GS that then you set up a whole almost assembly line of your process. But as we've seen from examples in our community, people are getting very creative. It's no longer just a linear sequence of how you got to your design. It becomes a very experiential story, as David was saying, that the authenticity of how you can build a space to tell your story is a tool that, it's really taking everything to the next level. I see the value of GS as this tool that can be plugged in at all times of the process. I've tested it in early research, early ideation, farther ideation, final design, even after you present the final design. Many times we host final design exhibitions in which we're still taking the community's feedback and making real-time adjustments in the final design or in the final presentation room. So for me, it's very interesting how it's adapted to the design process. And kind of as a side note, I can tell you I've brought GS to other industries or other disciplines like aerospace engineering, urban planning, and they're just really blown away by what they can do. So we're currently testing this idea of how can we use GS as a tool for mapping out some concepts for a NASA grant that we have. So I'm really passionate about this idea of how can GS and AR, VR be used in places where it hasn't been used before? And honestly, the potential is really up to us.
Yeah. No, I want to learn more about this NASA project. That sounds really exciting. Again, I want to just kind of touch on the design process again. I think the task that designers have is extremely challenging. They have to come up with something that is new, it's functional, it meets ergonomic needs, it's sustainable, and it kind of ties in with the brand identity that they're designing for. And it's also, there's no real reference aside for like last season's product, right? There's no real reference to kind of go off of in terms of it's going to look and feel like this, but it's going to be like this. So hand gestures and all this stuff just doesn't add up, and neither does text. You kind of got to deliver communication through visuals, which is what designers are experts at. I want to talk about miscommunication because ultimately we have to communicate the vision, and sometimes that sketch or even sometimes the 3D doesn't quite communicate it. So you need to have other elements that reinforce it. Maybe just from each of you guys, a time in which miscommunication led the team down the wrong path, and what are some of the consequences of miscommunication in the design journey? And then we'll bring it back to a couple of more questions around how we present. But I really want to just like linger a little bit on the impact of poor communication and how that can affect. And if we can do it through examples, that would be amazing.
Yeah, sure. I think a big part of the footwear product creation process is after something called a tech pack, which is essentially like an engineering document that is for some reason tasked the designer to create, gets handed off to the factory. For production, there are prototypes that have to be created in order to trial and hit the designer's intent, right? And those are traditionally 2D documents. And what you see is a lot of time is spent communicating kind of back and forth between the design team and the development and factory partners overseas on whether or not they're able to produce something that looks like the original designer's sketch or the designer's intent, right? And there's many rounds of this that takes months and months and months of time traditionally, right? And so in a recent case, I'm not going to share the specific project name, but there was like a molded shoe that had a very intricate kind of perforation pattern on a highly curved part of the shoe, right? And it was extremely difficult to communicate via traditional 2D means the exact shape, geometry, and placement of those that perforation pattern to align with the designer's original intent in a 2D document, right? And so what we were able to do is work with that designer in Gravity Sketch to communicate the placement, geometry, and shape of those perforations exactly how they intended it in 3D spatially along those curved surfaces, mapped precisely to the visual that the designer wanted to achieve at scale, right? At the correct scale and the correct visual fidelity and clarity. And within one round, the problem was solved, right? And it saved like months and months of back and forth. And they were able to move on to like product finalization. And so it's like things like moments like that are really.
Yeah. So traditionally, if you didn't have, or you didn't go down that path of helping communicate that way, what would have been the other answer to that, to doing this? Because like, let's say in the world where this doesn't exist, what is now that designer doing to better communicate that intent?
To be completely honest, what would have probably happened is they would have ran up against a hard production deadline. They would have settled on something that looked good enough in that moment and close enough, right? Which is obviously suboptimal and would have led to a severely compromised product in terms of it matching the original design intent. But Gravity Sketch was able to really solve that in honestly no more than the session itself was like 45 minutes, right?
Interesting. Yeah. And yeah, Alejandro, any stories from you where, I think let's stay on the kind of doom story and we'll come to the success stories in a minute, but any story with you in your career where a small miscommunication has led to a pretty challenging discussion or even like a timeline crunch?
Yes, Jay. I can certainly think of a few examples, and I mean, what I can summarize it as is the design process is ambiguous, right? The design process is highly creative, it's highly experiential. Communicating ideas is not always easy, especially when you're innovating on an area that you just don't have a lot of information on. In my case, we've had a project with an entity that I can't mention at the moment, but it has to do with mobility. So we were helping support a new type of mobility concept with them. And they were not very familiar with the VR process at the time we began our design process. So the vehicle package is really what we were talking about with them. They're very familiar with the traditional process, so 3D modeling, on a typical CAD program. And there was a little bit of a miscommunication on what the right, similarly to David, what the right scale of this new type of vehicle would be. And the disconnect that I saw was many times when we're used to seeing a concept on a screen, we're bound literally by the boundary of the screen. So a very good success story from here was once we begun introducing them slowly to the power of VR, and in this case, Gravity Sketch, we didn't have to, it was not even a matter of fidelity. We were able to bring a very low fidelity vehicle package CAD model that they were working on. And this was a team of engineers too. So it had some pretty detailed technical components. We just brought it one-to-one scale, low fidelity into Gravity Sketch, and that changed the conversation. From that moment on, the fact that they were able to just basically sit on the vehicle and understand the touch points, understand that the scale could be changed a little bit. So the conversation was, how can we improve the ergonomics, the human factors of this vehicle? So for us, showing them this translation of 2D to 3D and just effortless. We imported the version of the CAD model they had and immediately set it up in one-to-one scale, and they were really blown away by how quick of a transition that was. But more importantly, speaking of context, the context that was missing in our 2D conversation was now resolved. I mean, 2D meaning the screen, but of a 3D model, but the immersive nature of being able to see where the gap was. So for us, that's been a typical, I would say, factor that in many partnerships that we have, they may not be as familiarized with some of the levels of GS and how it can inform new use cases or new information. In this particular case, it was really, really impactful. And from that moment on, every single meeting we had leveraged a little bit of both. And they were very excited to learn more about how you can validate 3D designs immediately in VR.
Interesting. Yeah, I was just share a personal story, mainly on like a very challenging, unfortunate but comical situation that happened to me when I was working at Jaguar Land Rover. So prior to going full time in Gravity Sketch, I worked at JLR, and I feel like as designers, I was sitting next to a designer, amazing designer by the way, just incredible. But as designers, we try so hard to kind of really tell a really cohesive story. First internally to our peers, and then also to like the design directors, right, and the chiefs. And we were working on a Range Rover concept, and my work never really got picked on that one. But this designer next to me, brilliant designer, and he had all these thumbnail sketches. And he was kind of telling the progression of his thumbnail sketching. And the chief came over, and like, oh, I love this sketch. And so the designer didn't get enough time to tell the story about it or anything. Just, I love the sketch. It was just some kind of throwaway thumbnail sketch. And he said, it looks like a platypus. And this particular designer was from Spain and didn't know the translation for platypus. I don't know if it's the same in Spanish or not, but he's like, Shay, what's a platypus? He's like, just make it more like a platypus is what the chief was saying, He's like, what's a platypus? So this poor guy had his Google, he had two screens. So he had Google Images on one screen, just scrolling through looks of platypus, and Photoshop on the other screen, trying to push this thumbnail sketch into looking more and more like a platypus for 2 days. He was at this for 2 days. So I think this miscommunication can kind of lead people down these wrong paths. And I think very fondly of that story because I felt so much empathy for him in that moment, but also there was no real way for me to help communicate to him or for me to help him communicate to the design chief, the real direction he was trying to take the work. So thanks for sharing those stories, everyone. I'll kind of shift gears a little bit and try to see if I can pull it back together. We have seen a lot of uptake from the community that's using the product under kind of the free licensing of entertainment. So, the last Chicken Run film, they used Gravity Sketch to do a lot of the sets for Chicken Run and understand scale and proportion. They built these beautiful worlds out. Avatar: Way of the Water, the concept artist used Gravity Sketch to do a lot of the villages that sit on top of the water and understand scale, proportion, but also just kind of tell this immersive story of what this imaginary place looks like. And I think those are like really obvious use cases for me. It's like, all right, you literally, like, the thing that you're designing is the thing that needs to be presented in some form or the other. But when it comes to the world of industrial design, product design, vehicle design, I guess you don't necessarily need to build out a crazy Avatar: Way of the Water world because that's not the final thing, but there is still value in doing that somehow. And I guess what I wanted to kind of hear the story from both of you guys, if you can, as much as you can share without obviously breaking any confidentiality, is like in your respective industry expertise, is there a story in time where you've seen a designer just completely transform the way they presented and told the story of their design by having like an immersive world that was just very experiential? I know we've kind of been touching on this, but I would love to hear like a specific story and maybe even something that you guys observed and kind of like the third party to and just kind of blown away on your own.
Yeah. So this wasn't necessarily a designer themselves, but this was during the product launch of a series of Converse models that they recently launched at London Fashion Week this year. And we were brought in to design an immersive environment that showcased the final digital assets of the shoes that were being launched in situ with the scene and the event that they were putting on, right? And that allowed these visitors to this London Fashion Week event to see not just the shoe itself presented in right, like physically, but get the authentic kind of digital story of how that shoe came to life in a aesthetically coherent presentation space, let's just say, or like a set that matched the sort of neon industrialized nature kind of visual direction that the entire event was set in, right? And that allowed these guests to really not just be able to experience the shoes as final products, but at scale, kind of see how it came to life, right? In one in the space itself, right? And that was really, really impactful. And there's a lot of good feedback around it. And that was something that we definitely want to kind of push and see how it could be, further developed in the future as well. So
yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I like these examples where designers bring people into their space. It's kind of like bakeries that have the window that you can kind of walk by and people on the street just kind of stop and just want to see how the bread is made or how the croissants are being made. So I think this example is pretty akin to that. Yeah, anything from your side, Alejandro?
Yes, absolutely. Well, I think, like I said at the beginning, for me, VR and GS as a presentation tool is one of the big two uses I have for it. The biggest innovation I see is that, as you know, in design, especially in automotive design, we usually have exhibitions, at the end of our projects, whether it's an industry concept or a classroom studio. At the end, you have a presentation, basically a poster or an animation. So that's a given. The interesting thing is with GS, you also add a new layer, which is you can present the project exactly in the context of the space that it's created. So many projects, for example, I'm going to speak more on the student side for this one, and I can give you an example from an industry project as well. But from the student side, many of the studios we have are focusing on Tokyo 2040, New York 2050. So highly conceptual worlds that they've mapped out, they've created mood boards. The interesting thing is we take VR as this tool of how can you learn, for example, from a museum experience? How can you set up a VR exhibition of your process? So bring all your 2D imagery, your 3D imagery, scale models of your GS, but set it up in Tokyo 2050. So I've had some really beautiful use cases of students who create a presentation room that literally feels like the future of the city that they're designing for. And the interesting thing is some students have pushed it so far that, you know, it literally defies gravity. One of the students proposed a concept for Tokyo 2050, and she built basically in space, an exhibition in space that you can flip, and it literally doesn't respond to gravity. So you experience the concept that she designed multiple iterations, but you're floating high up on a futuristic international space station, and then you're forced to literally flip the entire exhibition to experience different aspects. So VR can become this boundless tool. A short example I can give you from a more concrete project is we currently have a grant with the Department of Transportation here, and we were proposing this concept of mobility hubs here in Ohio, where Cincinnati is. And mobility hubs are these public spaces, these stations where you connect different modes of transportation and then go and do other things, but the hub itself can be a destination. So the exciting thing is in GS, we came up with a concept of the hub in which we're showing, you know, the different vehicles that go in it. We show the space, the urban space, but we hosted a VR exhibition inside of the hub of the process of designing the hub. And then we invited people to join in VR. So it's kind of an inception moment where you're experiencing the concept itself, but an exhibition of the process of designing the concept in VR. So it's pretty wild once you start pushing the boundaries. Those are the two big ones for me: exhibiting the process, but in the context of where it's supposed to be. And many of these projects are future focused, so why not create the future concept of the space itself and show the process in it?
Yeah, awesome. I love that. Another question on my side, just thinking through these presentations, if we didn't have Gravity Sketch, I know, or not just Gravity Sketch, VR and like even Zoom and like the kind of session that we're on right now, meeting in person is kind of the way to do it, right? But there's still so much value in meeting in person. Like we go to visit our customers. We just recently went to Korea and Taiwan to visit factory partners for our footwear, and it's incredible to be in person. There's just so much more information we can gather. I think there's remote and in person, and then like there's something in between with this kind of VR collab capabilities. And I kind of want to explore that for a moment. And I don't think it's going to replace in person, but it's better than doing this kind of asynchronous, or even personally, I think it's better than doing screen to screen. Maybe just getting your thoughts, Alejandro, and then we'll come over to David and just like it's not in person, it's not a screen call, it's something else, and what are the benefits of this kind of intermediate space?
Yes, Jay. Well, you bring a very good point, and I think especially for what I do, I like how you define it as this something else, because it really feels like it takes a bit of both the in-person and virtual environments, but it fits somewhere in the middle. In my opinion, there are two levels of this. Level one is basically you have a group of people in the same studio and you're co-designing a space, and you have a VR collab room, maybe around the physical mockup, and then in AR and VR you're co-designing. And then you have virtual guests join in VR from, for example, from London or from anywhere. And then basically you have this, what I call multi-level session. Some people are in person co-designing in AR and VR, and some people are just in VR, but in the same co-design space. So that's level one. Level two, which in my job, I've developed some partnerships with some other entities internationally. We're talking about this idea of 2 or more teams setting up the same physical mock-up in their studio. So let's say we're all co-designing a micromobile for a specific project or context. We have exactly the same mock-up in our studios where we have the same seating position, we have the same steering wheel shape, and so on. And potentially we're talking about 2 full multi-level sessions in 2 remote locations. So 2 different teams in 2 different places around the world, both of them in AR and VR, both of them with the same physical validation of the same mockup, all co-designing in real time. With some colleagues, we have a high interest in developing that exact use case and publish on it, because there really hasn't been anything on that end. And if I can add even a third level, we now talk about haptic technologies. I'm sure everyone in this call, we're all very informed with innovations in haptic gloves, haptic suits. So basically the next layer of VR and AR that can give you physical tactile feedback. So if you were to push it even further to that level, these co-located design sessions can leverage that. So whenever you touch with your haptic glove any VR object, it provides some feedback. So it gives that next small layer of realism. So for me, it really fits somewhere in between, but more and more we're thinking of use cases that make it even closer to being in person, especially if you set up the same physical mock-up environment. The main gap is that you can't just drop the headset and have a conversation on the side. Like, you have to be in the same call, but we're getting very, very close.
Interesting. Yeah, and David, how do you consider this thing as it's not in person, it's not fully remote, something in between? Maybe highlight maybe what are the values? What are the value, like what is the value of maybe doing this over one or the other?
Yeah, so I think in footwear you hear a lot of folks talk about when they take a trip out to their factory partners, right, to review a sample, they feel way more productive, right? Being in person allows them the ability to really quickly hash out the details that they want to discuss around the object of importance that's in front of them, right? I think that's obviously really valuable. And what Gravity Sketch allows you to do is experience that same sort of like subject focus, right? Where it's not just a Zoom call where it's abstracted in a way where you're either trying to communicate through a presentation or a Miro board or something. It's still kind of on a screen. It's still a lot of translation going on. In Gravity Sketch, you're able to have that one-to-one at scale subject focus that enables sort of richer discussion to happen around the object that you actually care about, right? Which isn't our faces, right? On a Zoom call, it's not you know, some 2D renders necessarily. It's actually the thing that is sitting in front of you at scale, right? That you could evaluate and have a conversation about. And that almost adds like another, quite literally like another dimensionality of information that you're able to communicate that you can't on Zoom, or would be extremely costly to, you know, fly out to another, to be co-located, right? And Gravity Sketch just kind of provides that medium to have that subject-based discussion, but remotely.
So you can have these discussions a bit faster, more frequently.
Correct.
Whereas you would only have these in isolation and probably highly condensed if you were to do it in a remote setting.
Yeah.
I think it's really interesting because you're almost an advocate for not doing photorealistic avatars the way you said it, because like it doesn't, like the faces and you don't read any of that, you're just reading the information right in front of you.
Correct.
That's
like I think in person, obviously there's like people have like micro expressions and stuff, and you could glean information from that as well. But what really matters, right, is the subject that you're talking about. It's the shoe itself, it's the sample itself, it's the design itself, or in automotive use cases, right? It's the vehicle itself that you're able to center in your discussion, as opposed to people's faces, right?
I didn't think about that. Yeah, so much of that could change. Like so much of attitudes or behaviors or those things can change your own confidence or even thoughts on the work itself, or others as well. It's highly influential to others. That's pretty interesting. You talked a little bit about low fidelity and getting a lot of value from low fidelity, Alejandro. I think this is one of the biggest gripes that we receive from prospective customers and prospective users is like, oh, it's just not like the fidelity is not high enough. And a few users in the community have actually proven that it's actually extremely high. And a few of our customers actually are like, whoa, they've taken it to dimensions I couldn't even believe our software can go to. So I really believe that that's the factor. I think it is the time it takes to learn, the time it takes to adopt. But also, I think just based on that example you gave, having something low-fi but at scale and something that you can move around is probably much more impactful than having something like really high fidelity but is fixed to a flat display. Can you highlight a little bit more on like the value of and just how lo-fi can we go and still get like much more value than working in I guess a medium that is devoid of one of the dimensions that we need.
Yes, yes, Shay. So again, it all comes back to context. What I love about GS is that you can use it all the way through the whole design process. In my case, I completely agree with you. Many times, higher fidelity is unnecessary. It could be distracting. Similarly to what David was saying on the fidelity of an avatar, that can be disorienting. That can take away attention from what you're really trying to validate. So for us, if you're really in automotive design or mobility design, if you're talking about function and really figuring out the function, the package, the lower the fidelity, the better. Because what you're really trying to figure out is the what, not the how, if that makes any sense. So for us, oftentimes when we're just beginning to set up a mock-up of a mobility concept, literally all we need is a mannequin in the right position and maybe just a boundary of how big the proportions of this vehicle are supposed to be. Simple wheels, wheelbase, and then an outline of a center line, and then mannequins. That's really, really what we need. And then slowly you can evolve and you can add context. Once you start moving into the actual aesthetics, the actual brand, the actual language, then you can start increasing the fidelity. I've been blown away throughout the year. So, like I said, I've been using GS since 2017 when we were just beginning to understand what this tool could do, and it's amazing how far it's come. I can tell you, I completely agree. You can truly develop a concept exclusively in Gravity Sketch and not take it anywhere, and model it in Gravity Sketch and present it in Gravity Sketch. We've had use cases like that. I've had both students and projects with industry partners or with other kinds of partners where we never left the software. We modeled a pretty high fidelity sub-D model shown in an HDR environment or shown in a presentation room, and we never had to go to a CAD software or a rendering software. It's a tool, and the power is in how you use it. For my kind of work, I like to spend most of our time really figuring out the what, so really on the early lo-fi stages, and commit to an aesthetic design once you're very, very sure. Because like I said, many people are very familiar with VR as a way of showing a final looking environment. In my experience, very few people, especially outside of design, know this whole other side of VR, which is the real-time prototyping side of VR. That's where I have found really interesting use cases where people were just blown away. They put on the headset, we show them, they make some recommendations, and in real time in GS, we're moving things, we're moving layers, we're moving the mannequin, and that kind of capability is really unknown to many people. I think throughout the work I do, I'm trying to expose a few more industries and a few more use cases of the tool, but for me, the biggest benefit it has is one-to-one real-time validation. I mean, once you have that, you can only go higher from there. Fidelity can only grow, but if you don't have the functional concept first, which, the lower fidelity, the better, because it's really, really about the positioning, the ergonomics, and that's a benefit that VR can give you. And no other tool other than a physical mock-up that is much more timely and expensive and so on. So as you've seen in your customer stories, many industries have redefined their process because this tool now fits in multiple places and it reduces the time, it reduces the costs.
Yeah, yeah. And I think like low fidelity, we kind of lose sight that like low fidelity is actually already used quite consistently in a lot of studios. And also a lot of design studios outside of transportation as well. Like in transportation though, I remember we had like a couple of mock-ups where we just had like we had a seat from the current model vehicle, but then we just had like literally a timber construction kind of loose kind of footprint of that. And it was like super lo-fi. It was, it was not, it didn't resemble a car at all, but we were able to get so much information about stance, about how the user's feeling in that environment, about ingress and egress. So yeah, totally understand that, low fidelity in this virtual space can offer a very similar type of experience. We're kind of going to start winding down. I want to show a couple of interesting product things that we're working on as well. But I want to just touch on, before we get into like some of the exciting product stuff that we're exploring, where do you guys think we can do better as a company? I think there's product level and there's maybe even positioning level, because this conversation alone, I've already thought of 3 or 4 things that we should be sharing a little bit wider to other customers. Let me start with you, David.
Yeah. So I think tying it back to the previous question about like this, the idea of lo-fi 3D, I would argue is something that Gravity is like a concept that like Gravity Sketch almost introduced, at least to the footwear industry, right? Whereas previously, when people thought of 3D models and footwear, their mind immediately jumps to basically a marketing level render, right? Or like a finalized realization of a design that was initially all done in 2D, right? Basically, an execution, an aspect of execution versus early creativity. And as a product, right, like Gravity Sketch kind of challenges that idea, right? Like 3D isn't just for execution, 3D is for, can be utilized effectively throughout the entire life of the design process, right? And that's just something, when we hear pushback about it needs to be more high fidelity, usually the reason is because those people's experience with 3D and footwear is exclusively on or informed by the industry standard of a marketing render, right? Or a final render, right? And that's our job to kind of challenge that and show them how much utility it can have, right? As an early ideation tool or as a revision tool that has literally nothing to do with final product visualization, but goes a long way into making the final product as close to the initial design intent as possible.
So showing the value of like just getting loose and quick 3D understanding.
Correct.
And we don't do a good enough job on. That's a good takeaway, definitely. Alejandro, anything from your side? What could we be doing better?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, judging by how far it's come in the past 6 years, I think it's really interesting to see all the use cases, all the tools, all the features that have come up, with all these years of being in that industry. I agree with David that you, especially GS, set the tone in many design industries from the beginning on what the power of VR could be. And then, throughout the years, we added AR, we added different levels of fidelity, different capabilities. Where I see the biggest power of VR in GS is that it's really a tool. The applications and the value it has is up to you. And that's where we're finding really interesting use cases. For me, some areas, that are still growing and I'm excited to explore more use cases is leveraging newer capabilities of the technology itself. So we keep seeing newer headsets, we keep seeing the concept of AR and VR, even the concept of VR versus mobile or 3D. So many of the exhibitions, many of the presentations I have with partners, most of them in many cases have not tried VR, for example. So what we do is we give them either a screen to look at or something like that. So I'm really interested in this idea of how can you have participatory code design sessions with non-experts, people who are new to the tool, who may be intimidated by the tool in some ways. This is a very specific case study, but I'm very excited for the possibility of the medium itself. So VR is the best possible place you can experience GS and a concept, but perhaps we can, just like you have been with 2D, there could be some interesting ways in which you can involve more people. And an example I give you is part of what I do here at the lab is we invite companies and we invite stakeholders from many companies and we host co-design sessions. So I had a group from a Fortune 500 company, and these were executives who really wanted to learn more about trends and where cities are going. One of the examples that we guided them through was a VR demonstration of where cities are going and technology. This was more curated, so we had our team showcase that. But I kept thinking, what if you could give them access to this experience too, and as non-experts in VR and GS becoming a tool that anybody can pick up. And I mean, this process has become faster and faster. I mean, the students that I introduce GS to every semester, they pick it up quicker every time. But I'm really interested in this idea of how can GS be leveraged beyond the VR headset. I mean, already in landing pad, we can see a 360 version of the model, but this idea of real-time co-design, and going back to your point from before, Shay, this idea of lower fidelity, getting to the insights is most important. And for me, that has tremendous growth. And then the final point is there are industries yet to explore. As you know, you and the community has found so many interesting use cases. I have a few of my own that I'm really excited to explore. So bringing GS and bringing VR to the lens of people who may not be familiar with these capabilities. I see lots of growth in that, just expanding beyond which you have beyond design and beyond some more artistic or creative disciplines. I'm already having conversations with aerospace engineers who have started to see some value in just really validating aspects of their process, because that's what they see a lo-fi mock-up and they don't think you can get up to a pretty high fidelity. But once you show them the high fidelity, then they realize, okay, everything happens in the same platform, and then that's when they become really curious.
That's interesting. Yeah. So being able to get into the product from different hardware platforms, and then just thinking a little bit wider than design and industrial design in particular. Those are good points to take on board. Thank you. We're going to just jump into sharing a couple of product things that we're working on. I will start. I'm going to give one for each of you guys, and I want just to get your honest opinions on them. All right. So the first one we're going to walk through is going to be for you, Alejandro. We'll continue with you. But we're working on automated decimation. So you can upload a pretty heavy file into landing pad, and then when you bring it into your VR headset, it's going to automatically adjust the file size to render on the device. Keep in mind, these devices are kind of mobile phones. And so, especially if you're in a mobile VR headset, it is literally a mobile phone. And, we're starting to see a lot of pain points in the community of like, I just can't bring this CATIA file in. And the CATIA file could be, so big, millions of vertices. And of course, mobile GPU is going to have a problem with that. So we've been working on, importing, as you can see here on the screen, importing a file of a very high fidelity. And then in the cloud, we'll decimate that in very strategic ways, so you still keep a lot of the resolution and the key points that are important. And then you can continue your design journey, whether you want to use that as a reference or modeling on top of, or hard points and so forth. What kind of value and how do you think the workflow would be amplified by having this type of technology in the product?
Yeah, sure. Well, this is pretty exciting because usually that's a pain point we've had with students and with projects in the past, is the size of the model is limiting once you bring it back to GS, specifically because of what you said. Many times, I mean, most of the headsets we use are portable in nature because they're very easy and accessible. So the Meta Quest 2s, the Quest 3s, and so on. So for us, having a native capability of decimating the model eliminates the need to have to do that. So many times what we do is before we import it back to GS, it's a long process in Blender or any other software where you have to prepare the model and decimate it enough that once you bring it back to GS or your presentation room, it works. So I'm pretty curious to see, what level of fidelity can you attain just natively in GS. I can give you examples from my students that they decimate their models in Blender, but still export it as an FBX, for example, so they still keep some of the textures and things like that. So that's always been a barrier, especially towards the end of the design process, when you have a final 3D model and you want to bring it back for validation in VR. So this could be pretty powerful. I guess my question is, how do you see the community, for example, experimenting with this, or how much modification can you make to the model?
Yeah, there's tons of parameters we can play with. It's quite expensive, if I'm honest, on our side, because we have to run everything in the cloud. So we're just trying to work with a few power users to unlock what the kind of the threshold should be. But right now we're kind of defaulting to maybe 3 levels of complexity. We'll get into more details as we progress with this work. But as a first stab at it, I think the team is doing an incredible job of just like getting the cloud to actually do what it's best at, is running these kind of operations in the background and saving your students and customers time of doing this in third-party software. The next, I'm sure this has a lot of applications in footwear as
Yeah.
well, but just running out of time. The next feature here is around textures and applying textures to the geometry. Huge request over time is like visually gravity sketches a bit lackluster, right? Lighting, some shaders, things like this. And so being able to add textures to geometry and then being able to manipulate those textures once they've been applied to the geometry will help better storytell, better kind of amplify how Gravity Sketch can be leveraged in different settings with different stakeholders. And so, David, I wanted to ask you, in the footwear space, I know there's a lot of materiality. We don't do a very good job at that. We're starting to play with rotation and scale of textures that are applied to geometry. How do you think this feature would benefit the workflow, and should we continue to progress in this direction?
Yeah, honestly, I think it's kind of a huge unlock. And I'll just give an example. Like one of the primary pushbacks that we might get to potentially holding a design review within Gravity Sketch is I'm not able to showcase visually the materiality of my concepts, and design directors don't want to hear just imagine that is a certain grain of leather, right? They want to be able to at least visually get an idea of, right, like the scale of the leather and the color at the very least, right? And previously there was no way to kind of control the scale and now, or the positioning, right, of these image textures that you would bring in. But with this feature, I mean, that just alleviates that concern entirely, right? Because even though you might not get like the 3D nature of the texture, as a presentation tool, you're at least able to immediately visually see the idea that you're going for in terms of materiality, and that just goes a long ways to telling a coherent design story, right? That was previously Gravity Sketch, you were not really able to tell that story. So,
Interesting. Yeah, we're definitely going to continue on this. This is one of the areas that we've gotten enough feedback that we'd be stubborn not to continue and try to explore this a bit. I want to thank you guys both for your time. It's really valuable, extremely insightful as well. Every time I have these sessions, I learn kind of a couple of different ways I want to actually talk about the product internally to kind of inspire the team. What parting words would you have for someone that's still on the fence, or maybe just has taken a first few steps into the platform, not sure if it's for them, still trying to understand it? Bits of encouragement you have for them, because when you learn anything new, it's a challenge, right? And so I think this is something that I'm always trying to help be motivated and encouraging to people that they are changing the way they work. I mean, sketching 2-dimensionally to sketching 3-dimensionally, it might sound simple, but it is a huge kind of shift in your way you think. So it'd be great to just leave with a couple words of wisdom, and then anywhere that people can follow you if you want to share your socials.
Yes, absolutely, Shane. Thank you for that. I think something I always say is, especially to first-time users, is you've never experienced anything like this before. This is the most experiential tool you have probably used, because especially in industrial design, you're used to these very complicated CAD softwares that require multiple commands, and they're pretty complicated. I always say Gravity Sketch in VR is just like sketching on paper. It will be very intuitive. Oftentimes you pick up the tool as you go, but also you have really good built-in tutorials. So my advice is, don't let that first barrier intimidate you. The process of learning this will be like no other process you've had before. It's much more intuitive. And secondly, you have access to so many videos from the community of how they're using it. I would actually encourage people to watch live sketching demos. Those are, when I was first getting started, those are the ones that I really picked up on, because you may see a short video of a demonstration of a tool, but if you watch a live sketching demo, you see exactly people, how they're using it. So that's my recommendation. And the final point is that VR and Gravity Sketch is a tool, and the power it has, it's really up to you. You've seen use cases, and you can see use cases of how people in the community are using them, but there's the potential for anybody who's listening to this call to find new use cases that apply to them and add value to them. That's where it really lies for me. as far as where to find me, there's a link in the YouTube live of my LinkedIn, but I can also, feel free to follow me there, and you find a couple other links once you're in my LinkedIn. So that's where I'll leave it.
Great. I think one of the core strengths of Gravity Sketch is how well it plays with a variety of different tools that you as a designer are probably already familiar with, right? From a full perspective, for example, like you probably already are very comfortable in Photoshop and Illustrator, right? And if you're just jumping into Gravity Sketch for the first time, I would really challenge you to think about not only how does these concepts or this new tool exist in a silo, but how can I bring all the stuff that I'm doing in Gravity Sketch for the first time into other tools that I'm already really comfortable working with, right? And just shout out to our YouTube channel. Like, it's an amazing resource, and there are a lot of videos already out there and resources out there to teach you how might a Gravity Sketch 3D sketch integrate with a traditional Photoshop rendering process, for example. Just so you're fully utilizing your strengths and your existing skill set in a new way that is enhanced and augmented by Gravity Sketch as a tool. Yeah. And where to find me? You could follow me on Instagram. My tag is at WavyZ with about 3 underscores between the wavy and the Z. So.
All right. Awesome. Well, thank you both. Really appreciate your time, and thank you all for watching. It's really important that we also continue to gather feedback from you all. So please leave comments in the video, and we read them, we respond, and we'll inform the next session based on those comments that you leave us below. Thank you both, and yeah, have a great rest of your week.
Awesome. Thank you. Always a pleasure.
All right, ciao.